Well, as we've talked about here, China's come under intense scrutiny for their official coronavirus numbers and for claims that they have downplayed the impact of the virus. Last week, the lockdown imposed on Wuhan, the epicentre of the virus, was lifted. The Chinese government are reporting there are just 57 cases of the virus per million in their population. By comparison, Australia currently has 251 cases per million. But really, how credible is anything much we're being told and about this and many other things coming out of China? Michael Shoebridge is the director of ASPI's Defence Strategy and National Security Program. He's been critical of China's claims and joins me now from Canberra. Welcome to the show, Michael. Thank you for being with us. You talk about lies, opportunity and coronavirus. You argue that President Xi's Communist Party is engaged in damage control and opportunism, I can't even say it, on the back of this pandemic. And you say Xi is trying to use this outbreak to make the claim that China's authoritarian system is best equipped to manage the outbreak and the virus, but you argue, in fact, that's not true. It's the opposite that's true, and that democracies are doing better.
Yes, indeed, Peter. And I think you can see China's political system at work right at the start of this pandemic, when it was the Chinese authorities' repression of information about the outbreak that brought the pandemic not just on the people of China, but on the people of the world. We're now living through a global pandemic that has a root cause in the repression of information by the Chinese authorities. But that repression is continuing now. We're meant to believe that infections in China have flatlined since February, despite the fact that this pandemic has proven incredibly hard to control everywhere else on the planet. And that remarkable reduction in infection rates coincided with Xi declaring a people's war against the virus and telling party officials across China that they would fail if reported numbers rose in their particular areas of jurisdiction. So there's a remarkable coincidence there.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to underscore that point. So we're talking about a mere 83,000 people in China, they say, contracted coronavirus. This is out of a population of 1.4 billion. This equates to 0.006% of the Chinese population. Now, we know how urban their environment is. We know that in Hubei alone, there are 60 million people. Help me out here. How does the rest of the world, and look at Australia, on one cruise ship, the Ruby Princess passengers have infected great parts of Australia, yet in Hubei, a province of 60 million people, where they say that was the epicentre, Wuhan being the capital city there, it never went beyond there. It never went to Shanghai, the financial centre. It never went to the seat of power, which is Beijing. I mean, how stupid does the Chinese regime think we are?
Well, I think they're relying on their information control, but there are some things we do see from the Chinese government that tell us they don't believe what they're saying either. If they have indeed declared success in Wuhan, why is this now open city even more controlled than every Australian city right now? We've heard that they've opened it for business. What does that mean? That means that apartment blocks still have one entry rather than multiple entries because the rest are all sealed up. People in apartment blocks are now allowed out for 2 hours a day. There are infection prevention and control teams across the city checking people's identity, making sure they're wearing masks, taking their temperatures. And when people turn up at work in Chinese factories, as it supposedly gets back to business, the businesses run COVID-19 tests and checks before they let anyone in. That's before you get to Fortress Beijing, a biohazard fortress protecting the Chinese leadership from the rest of the country and from international visitors.
So, look, we've seen some pretty terrible imagery, thuggery, I'd have to call it, on the streets in relation to this control of the population and fear that they've got to really just stomp out any sort of people behaving badly, not coping with the restrictions, any movement that there looks like there might be a further outbreak. So with all of that in mind, how true is it that the economy is back up and running? You know, I hear statistics from business leaders, economists and others that, 85 to 90% of the Chinese economy is back, that it's all back to where it was. Is that true?
I don't think it is. I think some advanced manufacturing can be put back to work reasonably effectively because those factories are essentially places of social distancing. They're not large workforces, they're mainly automated. And the way you can separate the humans in that system probably is workable, including in places like Australia. But wherever there are mass gatherings for work or for school or university, you can see China is shut. So the idea that their economy is back in business is no more true than our economy is fully back in business. But let's look at the political narrative here, because Xi is trying to tell the world that his authoritarian system is the one that's best placed to handle pandemics and other challenges. But it's just not true. He's comparing it with the US, which is indeed in crisis and struggling. But actually, best practice places on the planet for managing this pandemic are the world's democracies: Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia. And we're getting the public's cooperation without whacking them on the head with truncheons and hauling them into vans with internal security folks in hazmat suits.
I want to ask you about the World Health Organization. I went through some of the Chinese relationship between the Ethiopian chair of the organisation, how he was backed into the job very much by China and China's funding, yes, of Africa, but in particular of Ethiopia. And there's all these constant claims, lack of transparency, that we can't believe the numbers, certainly from the start of the year, in relation to the infections and the deaths out of Wuhan. But of course, the head of Wu is out there, head of the World Health Organization, I hate the acronyms, is out there backing in China's claims of transparency. We saw today, backing in the reopening of these wet markets. We know the wet markets were involved here, very likely. Certainly they were involved in the SARS previous outbreaks. Where do we go with these global bodies if they themselves now are buying the China propaganda?
Well, I think we've got to recognise that some of these UN bodies, and the WHO is an iconic example, have actually been subject to a hostile takeover by the Chinese state in recent years. The rest of us have underinvested in them, and therefore they have been bought cheaply by China, which is now using them for its political and strategic purposes. So the WHO, it's meant to be the world's high beam headlights to help us prevent and contain pandemics. That's its top priority. But what we saw from the WHO right from the start of the COVID pandemic was it acting like a rear view mirror instead of high beam headlights, protecting and insulating the Chinese government from accountability and preventing global action. Remember, the WHO criticised our Prime Minister for putting in place those travel bans, stopping Chinese students coming to Australia. Probably the single defining measure that's been the foundation for our success so far.
Yeah, look, I think China is going to be the enduring conversation of at least this year, I was going to say this decade as well. Michael Shoebridge, thank you very much for your time.